Welcome, everybody. I'm clinical psychologist Dr. Steve Thayer, and this is Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, the podcast devoted to exploring the frontiers of psychedelic medicine and mental health. My co-host is Dr. Reid Robison. Reid is a psychiatrist and a seasoned psychedelic researcher and clinician. In this episode, Reid and I discuss a recent Scientific American article by Harvard psychologist David Rosmarin about psychiatry and spirituality. We talk about a possible spiritual renaissance happening alongside the psychedelic one and how people are using psychedelics as a tool for spiritual inquiry. We share a bit about our own spiritual journeys, discuss mind-body dualism, warn about spiritual bypassing, and explore the role that spirituality plays in mental health. Please enjoy. All right, Reid, welcome back.
Thank you.
Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers podcast. Psychiatry has a God problem. This is the title to a Scientific American article that you sent me the other day that I found super interesting.
I think I like your title better, and it's a little funnier.
Yeah.
I think it said, psychiatry needs to do right with God.
Something like that,
yeah. But same thing. Does that mean God doesn't like psychiatry?
Maybe. I should ask him.
Him, they, them, her.
They, it. Yeah. But all that's relevant to, one of the points the guy makes in the article is that psychiatrists are notoriously secular. That, mental health has sort of eschewed and ignored spirituality to some extent for a long, long time. I mean, Freud called it, mass delusion? Religion is a mass delusion.
100 years ago.
Yeah.
That effort.
And we've been tapping that drum ever since.
Yeah.
And so when I was reading the article, I was thinking the psychedelic renaissance, this thing that you and I are so freaking excited about, is a lot of things, but maybe one of those things is a spiritual renaissance.
Yeah.
We're in like kind of a meaning crisis right now, and people are searching for answers to old existential questions. Why are we here? What's the purpose of life? Why am I doing anything I'm doing?
Yeah.
And they're turning to things like psychedelics when maybe organized religion doesn't answer those questions for some of us.
And you couldn't even go to church during the pandemic if you wanted to, for a while anyway. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting to look at the statistics of what happened starting in March 2020 when churches closed their doors where you couldn't go and worship, yet more people reported praying. Or it's funny, even in that article, they cited the rate of Googling prayer went up significantly at the beginning of the pandemic. And then there are also statistics, that have been around for a while, or studies have uncovered this link between like belief or spirituality and well-being and improved outcomes in mental health as well. Mm-hmm. But what you were saying about the psychedelic renaissance, I completely agree. I don't think it's a coincidence that psychedelics are showing up more and more at this time when we're all in a hot mess together and turning to ways of making meaning out of the struggle.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of mental health problems, depression in particular, it's a crisis of meaning for a lot of people.
Yeah.
If I'm really, really depressed, one of the things that's going on probably is I don't feel like there's much purpose to what I do, or there's no big point to what I do. And why get out of bed if there's no point?
Yeah.
It's kind of a hope killer.
Yeah.
And a lot of people find hope in faith, in belief that there's some greater, grander purpose. Whether that's from a God or something else, it does. It gives people a lot of hope.
Yeah, so I think you're right. It's not just a psychedelic renaissance. We've talked about how it's also a mental health revolution, but it is a resurgence of spirituality, or a turning inward and turning back to spirituality, God, whatever that means. And psychedelics are a tool for accessing that a pretty darn good one too.
Yeah. Maybe let's talk about that then. Psychedelics as a tool for spiritual inquiry and spiritual connection. So I know, like, for me personally, the experiences that I've had. Well, let's go back. Reid, let me tell you a story.
Right.
I grew up in a very conservative religious faith, the Mormon Church, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Here in Utah.
Yep. And I was all in, man. I was the most Mormon-y Mormon you'd ever meet. And it was really important to me as a little kid. I believed with, as we say in the biz, every fiber of my being and beyond a shadow of a doubt. Our Mormon listeners will recognize those phrases.
And you probably said those things from a pulpit as a young lad.
Yeah. Encouraged to say them, but I wanted to say them, For me, it was really, really important to do, what I believed God wanted me to do. And I was taught to follow this intuitive guide inside of me that we called the Spirit or the Holy Ghost. And it communicated to us via the pathway of feelings and impressions. Not necessarily voices, although it was referred to as the still, small voice. But for me, it was emotional. And as I progressed in my life, I eventually drifted away from that particular faith. My belief in the organization, the doctrine, faded for a variety of reasons. And I found myself kind of floating around in a spiritual abyss, in a void. Not knowing what the answers now to these questions I thought I had the answers to. Where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? And, that journey landed me initially kind of in a naturalist's point of view. Like, there is no God. We're just sort of advanced apes and pretty disgruntled and an atheist. But then discovered psychedelics, and one psychedelic experience I had in particular, I decided to ask the hard questions, like, is there a God? What is my purpose? What is anyone's purpose? And holy crap, like I got some very, very interesting answers, not exactly what I would expect, but I guess fairly typical of a psychedelic experience. Like, is there a God? Well, yeah, there's a God, but we're all God. Like, you're God, I am God, the earth is God, and we're part of it. It wouldn't be unsurprising to hear that from anybody who's used psychedelics before.
Yeah, so that brought your spirituality back. It kind of reopened that door.
And it's not to say that I have all the definitive answers now that I would love to have, but it did. It connected me to spirituality again, to something not empirical, maybe not something I could measure necessarily, and maybe it's still naturalistic, but it's of a substance that's hard to measure with the tools that we have right now.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting that, I've heard that from so many people about psychedelics bringing out their spirituality, bringing back their spirituality, and yet psychedelics don't point you towards a particular path or stick you on a religion that you have no idea about or is inconsistent with your life or what you know. Like, they might even turn you more towards a religion you came from or more towards a broader view of spirituality, but
they don't come with a book, right?
Yeah.
It's not like you take LSD and somebody hands you a pamphlet that's the doctrine of LSD.
Yeah, they're not a religion, of course, and that's another interesting point that we should circle back to is spirituality versus religion, or the difference. But a story back at you. My first ayahuasca experience, I went to the jungle seeking a new and improved treatment modality for my clients, right? Like, okay, what's for these hardcore conditions that are hard to treat? What's the most, the biggest gun I can get out? And ayahuasca is kind of notorious for cracking things open or its potential for healing. So I was looking in particular at the potential of ayahuasca for eating disorders. So I was going to go to a retreat, be the medical director at it for medical support, be a therapist at it, but the team there is like, you need to experience it first. And I was like, I get it. And of course I want that. I don't think I could really work with the medicine that well without, at least not as well. So that wasn't a hard sell. But what's interesting is what happened. I had thrown the baby out with the bathwater somewhat in terms of my spirituality along my own journey through, neuroscience undergrad, medical school, academic tenure track, faculty. Same thing is starting to believe less in the unknown and stick to the hardcore science of what we can explain. But this experience brought it back for me in also a kind of a dramatic way from ceremony number one. Like it just, and it's even hard to describe. Like we have a word for that, of course.
Right.
Ineffable, but it's so intense, like to remember it. It's like an embodied knowing of like, wow, there is this infinity and we're right in it. There is God, whatever the hell that means. There are these unseen forces at play of love and compassion, and there are these rhythms of life of the earth, and there's this living planet we're on, and there's these bodies that we have as a vehicle to access a whole inner world, that is really hard to quantify and describe.
Yeah, it reminds me of psychedelics. Michael Pollan talked about this a little bit in his book, How to Change Your Mind, but psychedelics tend to make the pedestrian profound. He talked about like the stuff you'd see in a Hallmark card, like "Love is all you need" or something like that. All of a sudden becomes the greatest universal truth, and you connect to it in this emotional way. When I was in the church, we talked about what it felt like to be overcome by the Holy Spirit, and different religious cultures talk about this feeling differently and manifest it differently. But for us in the LDS church, it was a kind of a quiet burning in your bosom. We weren't dancing around like the Pentecostals, overcome and speaking in tongues necessarily, but there was an embodied knowing. There was something you felt in your body, something you felt emotionally, which was one of the reasons why I got disconnected from spirituality when I followed that similar academic path you lined out. Because as a psychologist, I was learning about how our emotions could trick us and how our beliefs could lead to dysfunction. And so I was thinking, if I'm supposed to know the meaning of the universe by way of my feelings, is that a trustworthy, metric to use? Is that a trustworthy signal to listen to? And then through psychedelics, you have that ineffable experience that along with it has a knowledge, like an epistemology. You know something that you can't explain with words.
Yeah. And then, no, I agree. It was that way for me as well. And then since then, through more sitting with that question and that experience and more experiences, it started to make more sense for me. Like you're saying, that we do have this, we are spiritual beings, like Jung said. And we do have this kind of inner healer or inner guru or God consciousness within us. And we do have this monkey mind that is not, in fact, us. And we have these bodies, a vehicle for enlightenment with emotions that give us wisdom or signals of how to navigate life, and intuition that we might have tuned out by lumping it in with all this stuff that's a bit hard to describe and quantify.
Yeah, you hear people say like this: you are something wearing a meat suit, or this is a meat puppet that your spirit is animating. And it's tough to like dissect the God consciousness spirit from the body, and maybe we don't have to. Maybe they're not to be dissected. Maybe they are so inextricably interconnected that calling them separate things is not accurate. But it's hard to deny that there's something mechanical about the human body. I mean, if you watch a neurosurgery with somebody awake and they poke and prod certain things, not unlike a robot. Like, okay, I'm smelling this. What are you doing? Well, I'm just stimulating that nerve. Or my arm moved and I didn't want it to. What'd you do?
I've sat in many hours of those surgeries through med school and residency.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, and it is machinery, even though it's awe-inspiring, like, hard to fathom how the complexity of that came to be.
Right.
But it's still a body that's different than this consciousness, where you could see how we want to describe it as different. Even though, in the end, I've come back to this idea that the mind and the body are really kind of inseparable, practically speaking, in how we live our lives, at least.
Yeah. I'm recalling conversations about, I was listening to Joe Rogan and Reid Doblin talk about DMT. Or it might have been, I don't know, Joe talks about DMT like every other episode, so I don't remember which one it was, but they were talking about the machine elves and DMT being, a portal to a different dimension.
Yeah.
What's going on? Like, are we actually visiting a different place, encountering entities, or is this just, quote unquote, in the mind? And so it raised, I don't know that we have answers to these questions, but they're interesting questions in the context of what is mind, what is body, what is spirit? And psychedelics being this technology to explore those questions.
Yeah, and that's an interesting one, the DMT question, because, there's DMT that they were talking about. I think it was when Reid Robison was telling stories of how he smoked DMT with Terence McKenna and others. And there's this signature of every psychedelic where DMT is more commonly associated with visitations from entities or going to other realms, or this machine elf concept, compared to other things like psilocybin, has more of a nature and the world's alive kind of thing. And ketamine, I hear a lot of people describe as if you're in this like free fall Minecraft world where everything's like dissolving around you, or something along those lines. But this unique signature, and whatever that is, like a real other dimension or not, there's something to do with the medicines, I think, that tunes you into a certain plane of consciousness, a certain channel, so to speak. And if you look at ayahuasca that we're talking about, tunes us into a very feminine, like divine consciousness channel, where people describe it as the grandmother, or this loving way of waking you up. And it has, this connection with Mother Earth as well, and like healing and emotions and kind of flowing energy moving through all these wild, weird, wonderful things. So that's the way I've been looking at it lately, is more of the medicine helps us tune into that particular plane of consciousness where we can learn a lot.
Yeah. When I'm feeling skeptical and ornery, and I'm thinking about this spirituality question, I think about things like, the brain is a sensation and perception organ in some ways, and you're screwing with it when you're putting these chemicals in your bloodstream. Of course, you're going to have an altered state of consciousness, and it's, the machine that we are is going to experience an altered state, and then it's going to try to make meaning out of it, because that's another thing the brain does, is it's a meaning-making mechanism. It has a meaning-making mechanism to make meaning of the sensations and perceptions that it gathers. And like I said, when I'm being kind of obnoxious about it, I think, well, there's nothing real about any of this. It's just our brain trying to make sense of what we've done to scramble it a little bit. And I guess you could make arguments that that's as reasonable a conclusion as to what, or an interpretation as to what psychedelics do, as, we're being visited by machine elves. But there's something undeniable about what you feel. Yeah.
And lasting. Like, look at the Good Friday experiment, or any psilocybin study with a high dose for that matter. But the Good Friday experiment is just fascinating, where those OGs of the psychedelic glory days in the 60s gave a high dose of psilocybin to divinity students in a church who got a sermon. And then the vast majority, nearly all of them, had some mind-blowing spiritual experience. And then Rick Doblin interviewed them a decade or two later and found that these insights, these changes in their life remained. And just like we see in the modern day psilocybin studies where 70 to 80% plus at a certain dose are going to have one of the most profound experiences of their lives, and that changes you. It's not just an aha moment. You know?
So when we're talking about spirituality and psychedelics, we should probably also talk about, I do want to circle back to the difference between spirituality and religion, but this concept of the spiritual bypass, it's a term that I heard first when I became interested in psychedelics and mental health. But what's your understanding of what a spiritual bypass is?
Well, I like to look at it with an analogy that, and I borrowed this from a Zen author named Shinzen Young, who wrote The Science of Enlightenment, and I just love how he deconstructs a lot of these concepts into mathematical equations. It appeals to my kind of academic scientific path while honoring the spirituality that's come back.
It appeals to your nerd self.
Yeah.
Let's be honest here. Right?
Yeah, true. And so he describes consciousness as this 3-layer cake where right now we're on the surface level, the icing. We're just walking around the icing. And as you start to journey inward, say using psychedelics, for example, or on a spiritual path, whatever you're using, you could do the same, let's be honest, with a meditation practice. That's the tried and tested course. It's going to take a lot longer.
Yeah.
And psychedelics might kind of kickstart your journey, but this journey inward down to the inner layer of cake, many people are going to encounter some skeletons in their closet, some old wounds, some traumas, and that can be difficult. It's not uncommon to hear some wailing or crying in the ayahuasca ceremony space, or even in the ketamine room, for that matter. Yeah. But some people find these spiritual curiosities that is just such an intriguing circus of new, wild, weird, wonderful things, whether it be like contemplative practices or crystals and chakras and everything else that can be kind of beautiful signposts on your journey, but they can be distractions if you stay there and do not proceed on your journey towards source, which is the innermost layer of cake, like source, God, the true supreme self, whatever spirit, whatever you want to call it. You might get a little glimpse of that or feel it a little bit, but it does take a disciplined and continued approach to journey towards that more enlightened space. And I see spiritual bypassing as kind of just getting stuck in the distracting stuff, the easy things to play around in without forging through the hard work of a true spiritual path.
Yeah. So people sometimes using psychedelic experiences themselves to ignore some of those skeletons in the closet or these important aspects of self that you're talking about, and all the stuff. What's a better word for stuff? Like the paraphernalia or the beliefs that go along with it. I've seen this a lot in people who maybe have left organized religion and have found psychedelics. There's this big old void that's been left in their life, and they replace it with sort of their own dogma. And whether it's, I'm a pagan now, or I'm a Wiccan, or I'm into crystals, or astrology, or something like that.
Yeah.
And so maybe they're using, I'm sure all that stuff is good, can be, but for some people, perhaps they're using it as a bypass. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and I've seen people seek out psychedelic ceremony after ceremony for the bliss that they get in that moment, to the point where their whole life is looking towards that next experience. You're waiting for the next time you could feel bliss, instead of how do you feel it in the gaps in between. So it reminds me of the story when Ram Dass gave LSD to his guru Maharaji, when he's out in India, and Maharaji says to Ram Dass through a translator, he's like, "Give me some of that yogi medicine or whatever." And Ram Dass is like, "What does he mean? Like Tylenol? I don't have any Tylenol." He's looking around, and then he's asking his buddy translator, like, "What does he mean?" And then eventually he figures out, oh, he means LSD, because Ram Dass brought LSD to India and was sharing it, and Maharaji had heard about it. So Ram Dass pulls some out, and Maharaji takes one, and he's like, give me another, takes another. I think he got like 900 or 1,000 plus micrograms of LSD, a whopping dose. And before Ram Dass could even stop it, he's like, oh no, what have I done? Have I just killed my guru? Because he's an old man who's probably never taken these things. And then he proceeds to kind of sit for him. And I think Maharaji was even under a blanket for a time, and was messing with Ram Dass a little bit, like comes out and pretends to be freaking out for a sec, but isn't. But then what was interesting is the conversation after. In the end, Maharaji didn't really get affected by it. I suspect he felt a lot, but he, as this kind of guru who's learned to navigate form and formlessness, and like flexibility, like a willow tree in the wind, can flow through these altered planes quite easily, I'm guessing. They're talking about it after, and Ram Dass is like, could this be a useful tool? Do you see value in this? And he's like, maybe if you go sit by a lake and look towards God, but wouldn't it be better to just always have God in your heart? And so that, I think, would be another example of spiritual bypassing, where you could rely on these things as a escape, a crutch, a way that the only way you might touch into your spirituality, versus persisting through the work and the discomfort around your healing journey and journey of spiritual growth.
Makes me think of how we use psychedelics therapeutically in the clinical context. People are coming to us with suffering, right? That's why they're here. They want help navigating their suffering and healing from it. And, one of the things we do is try to, I think, I'm just thinking out loud about this, is prevent a spiritual bypass. We want to help people look into all the corners. We want to help people confront the thing that they've been avoiding, that's been locked in their bodies, that's coming out as self-defeating patterns. And I guess it speaks to the importance of having guidance when you're using these medicines.
Having someone kind of encourage you, hold you accountable even, or help you see the ways you might be bypassing, because we're all, let's be honest, we're all at risk for that, right?
Yeah.
It makes me, there's this yoga practice that I've gravitated to a lot over the years, Ashtanga, where it's a self-directed practice traditionally, where you get on your mat in a room with other people, but you go through a sequence, the sequence or the level you're working on, and you don't move on beyond it until you've kind of mastered the pose before. It's kind of reminds me of some of Bruce Lee's practice methods?
Martial arts.
Of repeating something over and over for mastery. But the thing is, we avoid the difficult stuff, or when left to kind of a natural flow, we're going to flow around what's difficult, and we won't then work our way through it without some encouragement, like, the instructor across the room, like, no, Reid, like, do that pose again, do that pose again. And helping you through it, or like adjusting, supporting you through it, like we do when someone comes in for say, a psychedelic therapy session, and we're holding space and guiding and helping them with intentions, and ideally in a loving way calling them out on the natural BS that we all have, or tendency to take the easy path.
Right. Makes me think of something we've talked about a couple times, this Stoic idea of the obstacle being the path. Mm-hmm. I really like Ryan Holiday's book about this. The Obstacle is the Way is the title of the book.
Me too. Yeah. Or triggers are friends to follow.
Right.
Another way of saying it.
Or pathways to understanding or something like that. Leaning into the hard thing is not only courageous, but is actually the way to resolve the hard thing. It's not to run from it or hide from it.
Yeah. They are signposts to liberation, or that point us the way home.
Right.
Home being not like, so freedom or liberation from suffering, not from never do anything anyone tells you to do,
right,
or something like that. It's like there's pain that's very real, and someone pinches you, you feel pain, but then there's suffering, like our emotional reaction to it, or our struggle, our grasping, aversions, attachments. And that's what I think the spiritual path and psychedelics can get to, is all that optional suffering that we bring on ourselves, or we layer on through life.
Yeah. Now you're making me think of suffering. Like, the path to courage is through fear. The path to strength is through weakness. Like, if I'm bench pressing because I want to get stronger, I have to push that bar until I feel completely weak, until I can't move it anymore. Mm-hmm. And it's through that path of making myself tired and weak that I develop strength.
Yeah,
that's to me. I'm thinking the idea of the obstacle being the way, or suffering being the path. And a lot of these psychedelic experiences, these therapeutic psychedelic experiences that people have, you mentioned ayahuasca in particular, they can be sufferfests. Like, they can be really, really challenging.
Yeah, the only way out is through, right? You've got to feel it to heal it. Just like you're saying about bench pressing, is you do have to go through the tears. And it's a sad thing about trauma work, really, is why I feel for folks doing the work and see it as so brave and commendable, and really want to support as much as possible, because you have to go back there.
Oh, yeah.
Because maybe you didn't have the support that you really needed at the time, and you had to lock it away. And so here we are going back in bravely, like, to feel it to its full expression and then release it and let it go. Yeah. But that does create so much kind of resilience and skill and confidence in navigating these difficulties going forward.
Especially with developmental trauma. Trauma that happens when we're very young, as we're sort of formulating our personality and our attachment style. And we develop these bracing and avoidance strategies because we had to. We had to keep ourselves safe somehow.
Yeah.
And then to then deconstruct that in therapy, maybe as an adult, you're like, I'm doing all this stupid shit. Why am I doing it? Help me stop. Well, we got to go back to the beginning, and we have to make you really uncomfortable so that you can rebuild a sense of security and safety from the ground up. It takes a tremendous amount of courage.
And speaking of the religion versus spirituality question that we keep kind of
promising,
bouncing into.
Thanks for delivering on our promise.
Well, it just made me think of how, as kids, we get conditioned, right, by society, by kind of what happens in the bosom of our family. It's like these can be for better, for worse, right? But just like we might get conditioned into thinking, I'm only loved or lovable if I do this, or I think religion shows up sometimes, or can often show up, as a result of this collective conditioning of what's happened in the past, or this more kind of limited view of the spiritual path, where it has to be this way, but it might be layered with some things like, if you don't do this, God will punish you.
Right. Right. And you don't see a lot of people coming out of a psychedelic experience with that dogma.
Yeah.
I mean, some people probably get dogmatic, but more often than not, it's an expanding. It's an opening up. It's an accepting everything. Mm-hmm. It's more of that than it is a narrowing.
Yeah.
And so I think psychedelics, from a spiritual perspective, spiritual emotional perspective, can be really healing for people who maybe come from a religious perspective that was dogmatic and narrow and punitive even.
Yeah. It makes me think of another kind of funny concept that you hear in the ketamine literature sometimes, of ketamine as a chemical mindfulness tool, or a way of inducing mindfulness. And, I think mindfulness in the broad sense of the word, or when practiced, in the most spiritual way, is essentially spirituality. It's presence, it's expansion of this moment, it's opening up to life with the non-judgmental present moment awareness. And so the constricting or denying life, like we all do after trauma, shame, other wounds, is the opposite. But I think a spirituality path is a return to wholeness, a way of opening up more moment to moment rather than shutting down to life.
Yeah, and that really synchronizes with what I think is the source of a lot of pain for people, and also the source of a lot of healing, and that is shame, guilt, and lack of acceptance of who we are, right? That comes from kind of sinning against this narrow perspective of the way things should be, causing a lot of pain. And then the healing balm to that is opening up and accepting and forgiving and having compassion. And as I never met Jesus personally, but from what I understand, that was kind of his gig anyway, was love your neighbor.
Yeah. Yeah, an example of an enlightened, presumably an enlightened guru to walk the earth and show, a gentle, compassionate, loving spiritual path, or show that loving state that we can then model, like whether it's Jesus, Buddha, Maharaji, or any or all
Tom Cruise.
Yeah.
One of my favorite movie lines. Help me, Tom Cruise.
The forgiveness part is interesting. Wait, what movie is that from? The Help Me, Tom Cruise?
Is it Talladega Nights?
Oh,
I think
that's a good movie.
Will Ferrell's running around on fire, and he starts supplicating all the gods, and he throws Tom Cruise in there.
Oh yeah, there's some good stuff.
Help me, Jewish God. Help me, Tom Cruise.
And that reminds me of the prayer scene there, where he's praying to baby Jesus.
Oh yeah. Dear 8 pounds 6 ounces.
Yeah, we should be able to request Googling of a clip and play it on this podcast. Maybe we'll evolve into that.
And if any of you listeners, are deeply religious and feel like a little red in the face as we joke about stuff like this, just remember that, at least in my mind, humor is love. And if we can't joke about things, then it's hard to exist in this world.
Yeah,
that's my
Amen.
Perspective, at least. Yeah.
So on the forgiveness front, there's an author I like. She's actually a Buddhist psychotherapist, Thayer Brach. I love her book, Radical Acceptance, but she talks about the wings of forgiveness that can set us free, is that when we're not forgiving someone, even if they do not deserve forgiveness, even if they're a million miles away and we'll never see them again, we're holding on to this, like, this grudge or this hurt or this pain that just constricts our lives, until we set that free on the wings of forgiveness towards that more liberated state. So I think it ties in as well.
Yeah. Was it her or somebody I remember reading described, like, holding on to a grudge is holding a coal in your robes, like a hot coal in your robes, and it's only going to burn you. It's not going to hurt anybody else.
I've heard her talk about a thorn story, I think, as well, as an analogy for forgiveness. Yeah.
Well, Reid, my mind's run dry. This is an important subject, and I think we'll probably revisit it again on the podcast.
Yeah.
Have some ideas to bring in some people in to interview, to discuss it. But thank you. Thank you for talking with me today about it.
Thank you, Steve.
All right. Thank you for joining us today. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Novamind, a mental health company that specializes in psychedelic medicine and research. You can learn more about Novamind's mission to increase access to legal, safe, and evidence-based psychedelic medicine at novamind.ca. If you like what you heard today, please subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're using to listen or watch. Also, if you're feeling generous today, please leave us a glowing review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you like to listen. This will help us get into the ears and faces of more people and help us put wind in the sails of the psychedelic medicine renaissance. Thanks for listening.